I always thought family betrayal would be loud, screaming matches, slammed doors, dramatic endings. But mine arrived quietly, like a whisper slipping under a locked door. One morning, I woke up believing everything was still in my hands. My grandfather's legacy, the business he trusted me to protect, the future I'd promised him I'd keep alive. By nightfall, it was gone. Sold. Erased. Signed away by the very people who were supposed to stand beside me. They thought I'd never notice. They thought I'd stay silent. They thought I was too naive, too trusting, too soft to dig deeper into what they'd done behind my back. They didn't know that the moment I opened those papers, those neatly printed lies, I felt something inside me harden. Something that wouldn't break. And they definitely didn't know what my grandfather left behind. A single clause. Overlooked. Forgotten. A clause that changed everything. But before I could use it, before I could even breathe, I had to understand how far their betrayal went and how far I was willing to go to reclaim what was mine. Because this isn't just a story about losing everything. It's a story about what happens when someone like me decides she's done being underestimated. So tell me, have you ever watched people bury themselves with their own greed? Before everything fell apart, my life felt strangely steady, almost peaceful in a way I didn't fully appreciate at the time. I lived in the small town where I grew up, a place where the air always smelled faintly of pine and old asphalt, and where everyone still held doors open for each other even when they were in a rush. Most mornings, I woke up before sunrise, my routine shaped by years of watching my grandfather run his business with a quiet discipline. I wasn't officially involved in it back then, but the rhythm of responsibility had been imprinted in me long before I ever signed a single document. I worked at a local marketing firm, nothing glamorous but comfortably predictable. I liked the challenge of it, the deadlines, the brainstorming sessions, the feeling of watching something I built come to life. My coworkers knew me as someone who always delivered, the type who stayed late without being asked and volunteered to pick up the pieces when others dropped them. I took pride in that. In being dependable. In being someone people trusted. Evenings were quieter. I kept to myself more than people realized, spending time reading on my porch or calling my grandfather to check in. Ever since my parents passed, he'd been the anchor in my small but sturdy world. He'd tell me stories about the business he built from nothing, the lessons he learned the hard way, the people he helped even when it didn't benefit him. He always said the same thing to me at the end of each call. One day, it'll be yours. Just be ready. I thought it was just another one of his sentimental habits. I didn't know how literal he meant it. My family, my aunts, uncles, cousins, were pleasant in that distant, holiday dinner sort of way. We weren't close, but we weren't hostile either. They smiled at me, asked the usual polite questions, and moved on with their lives. I assumed that was enough. That we were all fine existing on the edges of each other's worlds. Looking back, maybe that distance was the first sign I should have paid attention to. Maybe their indifference wasn't indifference at all. Still, at the time, I didn't feel threatened. I didn't imagine that anything as sacred as my grandfather's legacy could become a target. I trusted them simply because they were family. Trusting them felt natural, expected even. And, in a way, I was proud of that softness. Proud that I could still believe in people. When my grandfather's health began to decline, I visited him more often. I brought him meals, organized his paperwork, and listened as he walked me through the details of the business, the profits, the challenges, the employees who'd been with him for decades. He didn't sound bitter or tired, just determined, as if he was racing against a clock only he could hear. He wanted me to understand everything, to be prepared for a future I didn't realize was barreling toward me. He passed away quietly, without warning, on a cold morning I still remember in fragments, my shaking hands, the numbness in my chest, the strange calm in the hospital room. Grief has a way of distorting everything around you, blurring the edges of the world until all that's left is the echo of what you've lost. But even through that fog, I assumed something simple, that my family would help honor his wishes, that we would come together, even if only temporarily, to make sure his life's work continued. What I didn't know was that while I was navigating grief, they were navigating something else entirely. Opportunity. There were moments, tiny ones, that should have warned me. A door that fell quiet when I approached. A cousin avoiding my eyes during the reading of the will. A strange tightness in my aunt's smile. I brushed them off, telling myself I was overthinking, that grief made everything look suspicious. I had no idea that the foundation of trust one stood on was already cracking beneath me. That decisions were being made in shadows I didn't even know existed. And I certainly didn't know that my grandfather had left behind a detail, a single, powerful clause, that would change everything they thought they'd taken from me. But betrayal rarely announces itself gently. It waits, it watches, and then it hits all at once. And mine was already on its way. I didn't find out about the betrayal in some dramatic confrontation or emotional confession. It began quietly, almost insignificantly, like the faintest vibration under my feet before the ground gives way. A simple envelope in my mailbox, addressed to me in unfamiliar handwriting. I thought it was some leftover condolence card, another sympathy message from someone who knew my grandfather. I opened it without a second thought, standing in the dim hallway of my apartment, still wearing my coat, my keys dangling from my hand. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, a notice of transfer, and a copy of a sales agreement. I skimmed the first few lines without understanding what I was reading. Then a sentence hit me so hard I had to sit down. The business, my grandfather's business, had been sold, completely transferred, signed off, finalized, weeks ago. My name wasn't on any of it. My first instinct was disbelief. It had to be a mistake, some clerical error or outdated document. My grandfather had made his intentions clear. He spoke about the business the way some people spoke about their children. He wanted me to carry it forward. I folded the papers over and over, as if creasing them would undo their meaning. But the words were still there when I smoothed the pages out again. Sold. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. I called my aunt first. My hands were trembling so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. When she answered, her voice was surprisingly calm. Too calm. That calmness told me everything I didn't want to believe. She had known. She had expected this call. She offered condolences again, as if grief was the reason for the shake in my voice. Then she explained the sale in clipped, practice sentences. It was the sensible thing to do. Your grandfather was gone. The business needed direction. We made the decision together. We. That word cracked something in me, because we had never included me. Asked her why my name wasn't anywhere on the documents. Why I hadn't been consulted. Why they didn't tell me. Why they betrayed my grandfather's trust. But she kept her voice steady, as if she'd rehearsed every line. She said they assumed I was overwhelmed and that handling the sale would be too much for me right now. Too much for me. As if I were fragile. As if grief made me incapable. As if the legacy my grandfather trusted me with didn't matter as much to me as my next breath. When I pressed further, her tone shifted, not harsher, but colder. She reminded me, with a hint of triumph she didn't bother hiding, that legally they were within their rights. Everyone had signed. The deal was done. And if I kept questioning it, I'd only make things harder for myself. I hung up mid-sentence. The silence afterward felt like a thick, suffocating fog. My world tilted in a way I didn't recognize. Betrayal is a strange kind of pain. It doesn't hit all at once. It spreads slowly, like ink sinking into fabric, consuming everything it touches. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there for a long time, staring at the papers, my heartbeat a steady drum against the cage of my ribs. That night, I drove to the business myself. I needed to see it, to touch the walls my grandfather built. The parking lot was half-lit, cold, and almost empty. Only the manager's car remained. He had worked there since before I was born. When he saw me, his face softened with something like guilt. He told me everything. Not all at once, but in fragments, hesitant sentences, heavy pauses. My family had met with buyers behind my back. They'd pushed the sale through quickly, claiming my grandfather hadn't left any clear directives. They'd shown up with papers and signatures while I was still planning his memorial service. They had even instructed employees not to contact me until after everything was finalized. That was the moment the reality fully settled in. They hadn't just sold a business. They had robbed me of a future my grandfather had spent years preparing me for. They'd erased my place in his legacy as if I didn't exist. Something inside me shifted, sharp, cold, precise. It wasn't rage. Rage is wild and messy. This was something quieter. A clarity that cut deeper than anger ever could. I drove home with 1,000 thoughts swarming through my mind, each one darker than the last. I felt stripped down, hollowed out, but I also felt something else rising from the emptiness, a determination that scared even me. I pulled out my grandfather's documents, the binders he'd walked me through over the past year. I searched every page, every note, every scribble. Hours passed. My apartment grew cold. I barely noticed. I kept reading, and that's when I found it. A clause buried deep in the original articles of incorporation. A clause I had forgotten about until that moment. One my family clearly hadn't bothered to read. A clause that stated that in the event of the founder's death, full control would automatically transfer to the designated heir, me. Not partial control. Not majority influence. Full control. And this clause nullified any sale made without the heir's explicit written consent. They had no idea. I stared at the words, my pulse racing. My grandfather had protected me even after he was gone. He had known that people could be careless or greedy or manipulative. And he had safeguarded the business accordingly. All their signatures, all their rushed decisions, all the lies they told. Invalid. But I didn't run to them with this information. Not yet. The part of me that would have reacted impulsively was gone, replaced with something much colder, much sharper. I needed to be smart, strategic, calculated. I reached out to a lawyer, not a local one, but someone my grandfather had worked with years ago. A man with a reputation for being relentless. When I told him what happened, he didn't sound shocked. He sounded angry on my behalf. He said he'd start reviewing everything immediately. In the meantime, I stayed quiet. My family thought I was grieving, licking my wounds. They had no idea I was preparing to dismantle everything they thought they'd successfully stolen. A week later, my lawyer called. His voice held a weight I instantly understood. He told me the sale was not only invalid, it was illegal. And worse for them, it appeared they intentionally bypassed me, which opened the door for serious consequences. Not just restitution, not just reversal, but potential fraud charges. Their greed had dug them a hole so deep they didn't even realize how far they'd fallen. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. I needed them to feel what I felt. I needed them to understand the cost of underestimating me. So I made a plan. One that would unfold slowly, meticulously, leaving no room for escape. I began gathering every document, every email, every detail my lawyer needed to build the case. I contacted former employees, business partners, vendors. People talked. People remembered things. People were willing to help. Piece by piece, the truth began forming a picture even uglier than I expected. My family hadn't just sold the business. They had exploited it for months, siphoning off profits, cutting corners, and using my grandfather's trust as a shield for their selfishness. The deeper I looked, the darker it got. And with every revelation, my resolve sharpened. I wasn't just going to take back what was mine. I was going to watch them unravel under the weight of their own deception. Because the clause my grandfather left behind wasn't just a legal safeguard. It was the fuse. And I was ready to light it. The day everything came to a head didn't arrive quietly. It didn't slip in like the betrayal had. It crashed into my life with a force I felt in every breath, every heartbeat. My lawyer had finished assembling the case. Every fraudulent signature, every concealed document, every careless misstep my family thought I'd never uncover. All the evidence sat neatly in a thick folder on my kitchen table, but it felt heavier than any weight I'd ever carried. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. This wasn't just paper. This was my grandfather's voice speaking from beyond the grave. This was justice wrapped in ink. This was the moment I had been building toward, quietly, methodically, patiently, while my family celebrated their supposed victory. The meeting they had arranged, the one I'd been invited to as an afterthought, was held at the office that had once felt like home. They assumed it was just a formality. They assumed I'd show up mourning, confused, maybe even grateful for the difficult decisions they'd made for me. They assumed they still controlled the narrative. They had no idea what was coming. I entered the conference room with the kind of calm that unnerves people. My aunt, 2 uncles, and a cousin were already there, dressed like they were preparing for a photo op rather than a reckoning. Their smiles faltered when they saw the folder in my hand. My aunt opened her mouth to start whatever speech she'd practiced, but I raised a hand, and she actually went silent. For the first time in weeks, I controlled the room. I placed the folder on the table with a soft thud. "Before we start," I said, my voice steady, "I think you should see this." My uncle scoffed, muttering something about dramatic theatrics, but when I opened the folder and spread the documents across the table, the room shifted. The air tightened. Their eyes darted across the pages, first with confusion, then dawning awareness, then something closer to fear. The clause. The transfer of authority. The legal invalidation of the sale they'd orchestrated. The evidence of their deliberate concealment. Every page was a mirror reflecting their own actions back at them. And for once, they had to look. My cousin reached for one of the documents, his hand trembling slightly. This can't be right." His voice cracked on the last word. "It's very right," I replied. "And legally, it overrides every decision you made." My aunt's face drained of color. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I understand," I said quietly. "I understand exactly what you did, and exactly what happens next." My lawyer stepped into the room then, right on cue. Their eyes widened when they saw him. They recognized him. He'd represented my grandfather years ago. And he wasn't a man you wanted to be on the wrong side of. He explained it concisely, clinically, almost coldly. The sale was invalid. Their signatures had no power. Their actions potentially constituted fraud. There would be investigations, hearings, consequences. Serious ones. Panic spread across their faces, like cracks in thin glass. My uncle tried to argue, but his voice shook. My aunt whispered that this had gone too far. My cousin put his head in his hands. They tried to blame each other, talking over one another in frantic, jumbled sentences. For a moment, I almost felt the weight of what was happening. This was my family. People I had grown up around, celebrated holidays with. People who had smiled at me even as they plotted behind my back. I felt something tighten in my chest, grief, maybe, but not for them. For the illusion I once had of who they were. Then the moment passed. Because this unraveling, this reckoning, wasn't something I created. It was something they built with every selfish choice, every lie, every signature they hoped I'd never see. When my lawyer laid out the immediate steps, the reinstatement of my ownership, the investigation into their actions, the freeze on any funds they had taken, my aunt's voice broke. "You're ruining us," she whispered. I looked her in the eye, my voice quiet but unwavering. "No. You ruined yourselves the moment you decided I didn't matter." Silence settled over the room, thick and suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. They could feel it, the shift in power, the ending of the story they thought they'd written. But I wasn't done. I stood, collected the documents they no longer had any right to touch, and paused at the doorway. I didn't turn around when I spoke. My voice didn't need volume to carry something sharp. "You underestimated me," I said. "And that was your first mistake." I walked out before they could reply, the weight of the folder warm in my hands, my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. As the door closed behind me, I felt something inside me settle, a cold, clear calm that came from finally reclaiming what was mine. But revenge has many layers. And while the legal battle was won, the aftermath was far from over. Because taking back the business was only the beginning. Now, they had to live with what they'd done. And I had one final decision to make, one that would determine just how deep my revenge would go. When I stepped out of that conference room, the first thing I felt wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. or relief, or even anger finally cooling. It was quiet, an almost unsettling quiet, like the moment after a storm when the world hasn't yet decided what comes next. I had reclaimed what was mine. I had exposed the truth. I had forced them to face consequences they spent weeks assuming they'd avoided. But revenge, even when justified, doesn't wrap itself neatly around your heart. It settles in layers, some sharp, some heavy, some that take time to understand. Over the following weeks, the fallout unfolded with a slow, deliberate inevitability. Investigators reached out. Statements were collected. My family members, once so confident, now clung to excuses that contradicted their earlier certainty. Their neat, polished version of events cracked under pressure. And every time a new update surfaced, another discrepancy, another lie, another piece of evidence proving what they'd done, I felt a mixture of vindication and disbelief. I regained full ownership of the business almost immediately. Legally, it had never left my hands. I walked the halls my grandfather built, feeling the echoes of his presence in every room. The employees welcomed me with a quiet kind of relief, as though they'd been waiting for someone to steady the ground beneath them. But stepping into leadership wasn't just about reclaiming inheritance, it was about stepping into the version of myself my grandfather always believed I could be. And that realization hit me harder than anything else. I threw myself into rebuilding, not just the business, but its culture, its direction, its sense of purpose. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt aligned with something bigger than the pain I'd endured. As the weeks stretched into months, the consequences for my family solidified. Some faced legal repercussions. Others were forced to repay what they'd taken. A few reached out to me, not with apologies, but with desperate attempts to rewrite the narrative. They wanted forgiveness without accountability, closure without ownership, peace without the discomfort of admitting what they'd done. I didn't respond, not out of hatred, but because silence was the only truthful answer left. They'd made their choices. Now they had to live inside the world those choices created. The people around me kept saying I'd won. But winning wasn't the feeling that followed me from room to room. What I felt was steadier, quieter, more complicated. Revenge had given me justice, yes. It had given me clarity. It had given me the truth unmasked. But it also forced me to confront what betrayal does to a heart that tries to stay soft. I learned that revenge doesn't erase the wound. It simply stops the bleeding long enough for you to see what needs to heal. In the end, the real victory wasn't watching my family fall. It was watching myself rise, piece by piece, into someone stronger, sharper, more certain of her worth. Someone who no longer mistook silence for safety or trust for inevitability. Someone who could finally stand on her own terms. I kept one of my grandfather's old notebooks on my desk. Inside it, written in his uneven handwriting, were the words he always lived by. Honor isn't something people give you. It's something you protect. For a long time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I do. Revenge wasn't just about reclaiming a business or exposing a lie. It was about protecting the truth of who I am and who he raised me to be. Life has a way of testing us in ways we never expect, quietly, painfully, relentlessly. And sometimes the people we trust the most become the ones who teach us the hardest lessons. But here's what I learned. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it looks like a clause buried in a stack of old papers, or a strength you don't realize you have until you're forced to use it.
And revenge?
Revenge is rarely about destruction. More often, it's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that someone tried to take away. I reclaimed mine. And I'm still learning what it means to carry that weight with purpose instead of anger. So now I leave you with this. When someone betrays you, when they try to take what's yours or underestimate your worth, what will you do? Will you let their actions define the rest of your story? Or will you reclaim your power and write the ending they never saw coming?